Ancient Greek civilization is often remembered as one of the cornerstones of Western culture. Its philosophy, art, architecture, and political systems continue to shape our world today. Yet, behind this brilliance lay darker, more unsettling aspects. Nowhere is this contrast more striking than in the realm of sexuality. What we now view as shocking or incomprehensible practices were once deeply embedded in Greek society, intertwined with power, hierarchy, and religion. In ancient Greece, sexuality was never confined to the bedroom. It was woven into politics, faith, and everyday life. One of the most defining features of Greek society was its reliance on slavery. Slaves were expected to fulfill every need of their masters, and sexual service was among these obligations. Male slaves, young boys, and women were often forced into sexual submission, stripped of choice or consent. In a culture where slavery itself was seen as natural and unquestionable, such exploitation was not regarded as immoral or criminal. This normalized abuse formed one of the darkest aspects of Greek sexual life. Greek mythology also played a key role in shaping attitudes towards sexuality. The gods themselves embodied excess, desire, and transgression. Zeus, notorious for his lust, often disguised himself, sometimes as animals, sometimes in human forms, to seduce or assault both women and men. These myths, far from being condemned, were accepted as cultural narratives and even used to justify similar behaviors among mortals. For instance, the myth of a god desiring a young boy made same-sex attraction and relationships appear natural and acceptable. Among men, relationships with adolescent boys were particularly notable. Known as pederasty, this practice involved adult men forming sexual and social bonds with boys on the verge of puberty. These relationships were often framed as mentorships, blending education with intimacy. But beneath this guise of teaching lay clear exploitation. What today would be recognized as abuse was, in many Greek city-states, a socially sanctioned and even celebrated institution, considered an integral part of a young man's upbringing. Women, by contrast, endured an even harsher reality. In most Greek states, Sparta being a partial exception, women were confined to the household, valued primarily for their role in producing heirs. Their voices carried little weight in society, and their sexuality was largely controlled by men. While wives were reserved for reproduction, men often pursued passion and desire elsewhere, with slaves, prostitutes, or young boys. For many women, life meant being reduced to a biological function, with no opportunity for autonomy or fulfillment. Religion, too, was intertwined with sexual practices. Sacred rituals and festivals often involved sexual acts performed in honor of the gods. In certain temples, group sexual rites took place, and in some cases, virgins or youths were offered to deities through sexual initiation. Dionysian festivals, marked by drunkenness, ecstatic dancing, and frenzied behavior, frequently descended into uncontrolled orgies. Because these acts were framed as sacred obligations, participation was seen as unavoidable. Another disturbing dimension was the presence of bestiality in both myth and imagination. Tales such as Leda seduced by Zeus in the form of a swan, or the story of Pasiphae and the bull leading to the birth of the Minotaur, reveal how deeply such themes permeated Greek culture. While these myths may not reflect everyday practices, they illustrate that the boundaries of sexual thought extended far beyond what we consider acceptable today. Taken together, these examples reveal that ancient Greece was not only a cradle of rational thought, beauty, and democracy, but also a society deeply entangled with the extremes of human desire. It pursued ideals of intellect and aesthetics, yet simultaneously indulged in practices of power, exploitation, and unrestrained passion. This duality, the pursuit of enlightenment alongside the embrace of darkness, remains one of the most fascinating and unsettling aspects of Greek civilization. When we imagine daily life in ancient Greece, we are confronted with scenes that are difficult to comprehend through today's moral lens. A wealthy Athenian symposium, a drinking banquet, was not merely a gathering for wine and poetry, but also a stage where sexuality was openly displayed. The women who accompanied the guests, known as hetairai, differed from ordinary prostitutes in that they were educated and able to engage in intellectual conversation. Yet, this did not mean they were free. More often than not, they were compelled to become part of men's lust, their bodies serving both pleasure and political strategy. Behind the rise of many statesmen, the influence of such women working in the shadows played a decisive role. Alongside the hetairai, enslaved women and men endured far harsher treatment at these gatherings. They were forced to dance naked and then offered to the guests at the command of their masters. For a slave, escape from such scenes was impossible. In the eyes of their owners, they held no human worth, only bodies to be used. As a result, much of the population lived under the constant threat of sexual violence. The boundlessness of Greek sexuality reached even more disturbing extremes in practices involving animals. The myth of the Minotaur's birth illustrates this cultural undercurrent. According to legend, Pasiphae, the wife of King Minos of Crete, cursed by the gods, fell in love with a bull and conceived a half-human, half-bull creature. While mythological, the very circulation of such stories indicates that bestiality had a place in the collective imagination. Some historians suggest that, especially in rural areas, secret sexual encounters with animals did occur. This highlights how far Greek conceptions of sexuality could stretch beyond accepted norms. Another dark practice was the forced involvement of children in sexuality. Beyond pederasty, enslaved children were often exploited for their masters' amusement. Such acts were not exceptions, but deeply embedded in the social order. Tragically, the legal system offered no protection to slaves or children. Men with power acted without restraint, believing it their right to do so. This unchecked authority was one of the most terrifying aspects of Greek sexual life. Religious rituals added yet another disturbing layer. Beyond the famous Dionysian festivals, ceremonies such as the Eleusinian Mysteries are rumored to have involved sexual trials for participants. Approaching the gods was thought to require purification of both body and spirit through ecstasy and pleasure. Under the influence of wine, hallucinogenic herbs and hypnotic music, participants entered trances and were driven to extreme sexual acts. Framed as sacred devotion, these rites often became terrifying and traumatic experiences. Funerary rituals, too, sometimes incorporated sexuality. In certain regions, it was believed that the souls of the dead could find peace only if a young boy or girl lost their virginity as part of the ceremony. Youths were thus forced into sexual acts against their will, all under the guise of honoring the deceased. This grim tradition shows that sexuality was not seen merely as a personal desire, but as a communal duty. War was no exception. Sexuality and battle were intertwined in the belief that intimate bonds among soldiers fostered greater courage. The most famous example was Thebes' sacred band, composed of 150 pairs of male lovers who fought and lived together. Their loyalty to each other made them a formidable force in the Greek world. Yet this model also trapped young men in a cycle of military and sexual obligation, erasing their personal agency. Altogether, these practices reveal the shadow that lurked behind ancient Greece's celebrated brilliance. While this civilization gifted humanity with philosophy, art, and democracy, it simultaneously legitimized some of the most brutal and exploitative sexual customs in history. This contradiction between intellectual enlightenment and the darkness of unchecked desire renders ancient Greece both admirable and profoundly unsettling. To truly understand the sexual life of ancient Greece, one must not only examine the practices among the people, but also the ideas of the philosophers of the time. Philosophers were not simply thinkers. They were intellectual figures who legitimized or shaped social behavior. For example, Plato in his Symposium discusses different forms of love. For him, love was not merely a bodily pleasure, but a means for the soul to ascend toward beauty. Yet what is striking is that Plato regarded relationships between men as more noble. Love with women was seen as bodily and ordinary, whereas the bond between an adult man and a young boy was believed to nurture the soul and aid intellectual growth. This perspective gave philosophical legitimacy to the practice of pederasty, reinforcing its entrenchment in society. Similarly, Xenophon, in his depictions of Athenian life, describes men's attraction to other men as a common and natural occurrence. Women, largely confined to the household, were excluded from male social life, which meant that men sought passion and desire outside, with young men in particular. What emerges is a society where women were consistently relegated to the background, while male-male relationships were elevated as superior. A more disturbing case can be found in Aristotle. He defended slavery as part of the natural order. According to him, some people were slaves by nature, destined to serve their masters. While he did not discuss sexuality in detail, this framework provided moral cover for the sexual exploitation of slaves, making their abuse appear as a natural right of the master. One of the reasons sexuality became normalized in Greece was the openness of daily life. What we now regard as private was often practiced in public. In Athens, gymnasiums were not only training grounds for sport, but also spaces where men exercised naked, openly displaying their bodies. This nudity fostered environments where sexual desire between men could flourish. Young boys' bodies were openly exposed to the gaze of older men, and these encounters often became the starting point for new relationships. In marketplaces and public squares, prostitutes were also a common sight. The port of Piraeus, for instance, was filled with lower-class women who offered their services at very low prices, making prostitution accessible even to slaves and the poor. Yet these women lived lives of extreme hardship, marked by disease, violence, and constant degradation. Many were forced into prostitution at a very young age, with little chance of escape. Sexuality in Greece was not limited to heterosexual or homosexual relationships. More extreme practices were also widespread. Group sex, particularly during festivals and religious rituals, was normalized. These orgiastic events, fueled by alcohol and music, allowed people to shed their identities and blur social hierarchies. For a brief moment, slave and master could share the same bed. But these gatherings often descended into chaos, violence, and coercion rather than freedom. Another disturbing aspect was linked to fertility and childbirth. Women, especially wives, were valued primarily for their ability to bear children. If a woman was infertile, she was often shamed or cast aside. Death during childbirth was common due to poor medical knowledge, yet men rarely showed concern for women's suffering. Women were seen merely as vessels for lineage. In some regions, fertility rites required women to take part in collective sexual rituals during festivals, stripping them entirely of personal autonomy. Greek sexual norms also reveal a deep injustice in how crimes were judged. For example, forcing a free man into a sexual act was considered a grave insult and a serious crime. However, committing the same act against a slave was not recognized as a crime at all. The issue was not one of consent, but of status. To be a slave or a woman meant to have no authority over your own body. In the end, sexuality in ancient Greece was legitimized through philosophy and normalized in daily life, permeating every layer of society. Today, we remember this civilization as the birthplace of democracy and free thought, yet behind that image lay a society in which slaves, women and children were systematically exploited. Their enlightened world, in truth, carried very dark shadows. Some 4th century BCE court speeches from Athens provide surprisingly detailed insights into the sexual customs of the time. For example, in the famous oration against Timarchus by the orator Aeschines, a citizen is accused of having engaged in immoral sexual behavior during his youth, and it is argued that he should be stripped of his citizenship rights. What stands out is that the so-called immorality did not stem from relations with slaves or women, but from a free citizen submitting passively to another man. In Athenian society, the primary concern was not sexuality itself, but the honor of the male citizen. A man who yielded to another was seen as behaving effeminately and lost his civic standing. The same act committed towards slaves or women, however, was regarded as socially acceptable. This example illustrates how sexuality in the Greek world was deeply intertwined with class and social status. Violence against women or slaves was not considered a crime, whereas the honor of a free man could bring a case to court. This profound injustice is one of the most striking contradictions of ancient Greece. Similarly, speeches by Demosthenes and other orators frequently mention prostitutes, hetairai, and slaves. Brothels in Athens were state-regulated and taxed. Instead of prohibiting prostitution, the state profited from it. This effectively treated women's bodies as public resources. While tax revenues funded wars, the income often derived from the exploitation of poor or enslaved women. Even more striking is the life of women in Sparta. Compared to Athens, Spartan women enjoyed greater freedom. They could exercise outdoors and accompany their husbands. Yet this freedom served the state's interests. Sparta sought strong warriors, and women's bodies were seen as production facilities to this end. Young girls exercised naked and were encouraged to bear strong, healthy children. Infertile women could be easily abandoned by their husbands, and in some cases were compelled to have relations with other men to produce healthy warriors. Marriage in Sparta was thus shaped less by love or fidelity than by the state's need to raise soldiers. In Crete, yet another tradition prevailed. According to some sources, young men were temporarily abducted by older men as part of a socially sanctioned rite. The youths were taken to the mountains, where they stayed for weeks, receiving education while also being subjected to sexual activity. Afterward, they were returned home with gifts. While considered an honorable right at the time, today this clearly constitutes systematic abuse. Even mythology legitimized such dark practices. The story of Zeus abducting Ganymedes is a prime example. Zeus falls in love with the Trojan prince Ganymedes, abducts him to Olympus disguised as an eagle, and makes him both his lover and the cupbearer of the gods. This myth effectively provided a divine model for pederasty. If Zeus could love a young boy, ordinary men's similar desires were normalized. Another disturbing myth is that of Leda and the swan. Zeus, disguised as a swan, seduces or assaults Leda, resulting in the birth of Helen, the future cause of the Trojan War. Here, coercion and sexual violence are central elements, illustrating how myths codified and legitimized sexual abuse in society. Even the minutiae of daily life reflected this perspective. In slave markets, buyers examined slaves' bodies, often leaving them naked. Slavery encompassed not only labor, but also sexual services. Many contracts explicitly described a slave's age, beauty, and fitness for use, proving that slaves were regarded not merely as economic assets, but also as sexual commodities. Birth control practices reveal another grim aspect of the era. Women were forced to use toxic plants to prevent pregnancy, induce abortions, or abandon newborns. Unwanted children, especially girls, were often left outside the city. This was not purely an economic measure, but also a gendered form of discrimination. Boys were valued, while girls were frequently seen as burdens. The sexual practices of ancient Greece had societal consequences that extended far beyond individual lives, leaving long-lasting effects on subsequent civilizations, most notably Rome. Roman society adopted much of Greek culture in both art and daily life, but some of these darker practices were implemented in an even more systematic way. The sexual hierarchy seen in city-states like Athens and Sparta, where men held absolute power over women and slaves, persisted in Rome in various forms. Slaves and adolescent boys remained subject to the desires of their masters. The historian Suetonius recounts that Roman emperors frequently used young men and slaves for sexual purposes, demonstrating that Greek practices of pederasty and sexual exploitation of slaves continued in a more organized fashion under Roman rule. Women's status was similarly constrained. Although Roman women were slightly freer than their Athenian counterparts, especially in the upper classes, their role was primarily a reflection of social standing and wealth. Wealthy women often existed as symbols of status rather than agents of love, desire, or emotional fulfillment. Most intimate pleasures were experienced in male-male relationships. This Greek inheritance reinforced women's social and sexual disempowerment in Roman society. The intertwining of sexuality with religious rituals also continued in Rome. Bacchic festivals, dedicated to Bacchus, the Roman counterpart of Dionysus, were known for public sexual encounters and orgies. Women and slaves assigned to temples were compelled into sexual acts under the pretense of serving the gods. These practices were socially legitimized and exerted pressure on participants, transforming sexuality from a personal pleasure into a tool of both religious and social control. Greek mythology's influence persisted as well. Tales such as Zeus abducting Ganymedes or the Leda and the Swan myth were retold in Roman literature, effectively providing divine precedents for sexual exploitation. This cultural transmission entrenched the association of violence and sexuality in the collective imagination. As in Greece, social status in Rome dictated the boundaries of sexual behavior. A free citizen submitting to another man was considered a crime, whereas the same act committed against a slave or woman was disregarded entirely. This clearly illustrates the link between power and sexuality. Those in power had the right to use the bodies of the powerless as they wished. The societal impact of these practices was profound. Women and slaves lived under constant fear and oppression, while the elite wielded sexuality as a tool of authority and control. This starkly reveals the dark undercurrent behind the celebrated, enlightened cultural achievements of ancient Greece. The Greek cultural legacy transmitted to Rome also left its mark on art and literature. Sculptures, frescoes, and literary works often idealized the naked body and sexual scenes. Yet behind this aesthetic idealization lay coercion and abuse, highlighting how artistic beauty and sexual exploitation were intertwined in both Greek and Roman societies. In conclusion, sexuality in ancient Greece was not merely an expression of personal desire, but an integral part of social structure, religious practice, and power dynamics. Women, slaves, and youths bore the brunt of this system, while the upper classes used sexuality as a means of control and status. When transmitted to Rome, this understanding became a foundation for the enduring relationship between sexuality and power in Western civilization.